Have you ever seen a magic trick and it left you with your jaw dropped and saying, I have no idea how they did that? Or have you ever watched a movie or read a book and you just don't know what's going on in the story, or you don't understand how the story ended? That experience or that feeling is called being mystified. The word mystify means to utterly bewilder or to perplex, or to make mysterious or make obscure. The book of Revelation, which is the last book of the Bible, is considered by many to be the most mysterious. Many think that the book of Revelation cannot be understood. It's just too confusing. Would it surprise you to know that this is the very opposite of the purpose of the book of Revelation? It says in the very first verse of this book, "This is a revelation from Jesus the Messiah, which God gave him to show his servants the events that must soon take place." We are told that the things in this book were given to Jesus by God so that he could show his servants. God revealed the future to his son, our king, and the king wants to share with us what he was shown. That means all of his disciples back then and all of us living today. So we are supposed to understand the book of Revelation. It doesn't have to be mysterious. It doesn't have to mystify us. In fact, we have one goal in these videos, and that is to at least begin to demystify the book of Revelation. To show and to demonstrate that the book of Revelation is not hard to understand, that is, if you have the tools to make sense of it. And what are those tools? Well, just like any other book of the Bible, we need to use the tools of interpretation. We have to put ourselves in the mindset of the writer of the book and the ones who received the book. Otherwise, we're bound to misunderstand. We need to ask questions like, who wrote this book? To whom did he write it? Why did he write it? What was the historical context? What did the various words, phrases, and concepts we find in the book mean to the people at the time? If we can find reasonable answers to these questions, then we will be better equipped to understand the book of Revelation. Of course, as I already alluded to, the book of Revelation is hard to understand and there's a lot of confusion about it. So let's travel to my favorite coffee shop here in Fawn Hill and also 2 Christian stores in Welland and find out what people there have to say about the book of Revelation.
Pretty relevant for right now. I believe, anything can happen at any moment. I think, as we get closer to, if it's the world ending per climate change, per biblical standpoint, it's like you don't know what's ever gonna happen. Like scientists have given us 10 years till like the world is going to die,
Right.
And I think it's important to be on top of it and take care of ourselves. So I think there's hope at the end of it. I think that's the point of, our hope in Jesus and everything, but I think there's going to be a lot of pain before that, so.
Right.
Comes to mind, and just how important it is that we're doing what God's called us to do, because Revelation speaks of how the end times and how scary it can be, but it also speaks of just how much God loves us and wants to be with us. So actually we even had someone in the store today, who was talking about Revelation and whatnot in the end times. But I think if we focus too much on the bad stuff, then we're not going to focus on the hope. We're not going to bring people to hope. We're saying, yes, there's the bad stuff, but there's this amazing hope that you have. I think when you look at the different churches, it very much pertains to churches in today's society, because you can correlate each of those different churches. It's like, oh yeah, this is the church. And even like with it, when it says you can't be lukewarm, you can't be lukewarm. Like that's today, it's so important that we can't have one foot in the world, one foot in the church, because we need to be hot for Christ. And if we're not hot for him, if we're not on fire for him, then we're cold and he'll spit us out.
First thing that comes to mind is a book that's hard to understand, that a lot of people do want to study, they have difficulty doing that, and I do think end times. I think it's a hopeful thing, and I think it should be a hopeful thing. For some people it is a very scary thing, but as Christians I think it should be a hopeful thing. I do think people do focus on it too much. There's a lot of books written on it, there's a lot that's covering the subject, and as time goes on there's more and more. And I'm sure that the book was written for us too.
The book of Revelation is supposed to be something that we can understand, something that we will be able to read and be blessed by. In fact, there's a verse, right?
Yes. Yep. Chapter 1, verse 3 says, "Blessed is he who reads, and those who hear the words of the prophecy, and heed the things which are written in it, for the time is near."
Right. So the book of Revelation does not have to be mysterious. In fact, I think that we should be able to use the tools of interpretation that we would use for any book of the Bible, and it would help us greatly to understand it. Like who wrote it? To whom did he write the book? What was the historical context? What was going on at the time? Where did he write it? And where were the people that he was writing to? All that matters because it helps inform the very reasons why the book was written in the first place, right?
Yes.
I think the first thing we should do, I think would be helpful, is to just go through the entire book, break it down sort of chapter by chapter, and know what's in it.
Into sections.
Into sections,
You mean?
yeah.
Okay.
Revelation chapter 1 is like an introduction or a prologue. And then you find that chapters 2 and 3 are letters that are from Jesus to actual churches or congregations that existed in the first century.
Yes.
And then what do we have in chapters 4 and 5?
4 and 5 is the scene of the throne of God.
So John gets this
Amazing.
vision of the heavenly throne room and the vision of God and his throne, and then there's the appearance of the one who was slain, the lamb who was slain, and he is handed a scroll with 7 seals, and the 6 seals are broken in chapter 6, and these refer to different judgments. Chapter 7, we get the 144,000, and then also the great multitude, and they experience the tribulation of those judgments. Chapters 8 and 9 has the 7th seal, and then that leads to 7 trumpet blasts, right? It's interesting. 7 seals, 7 trumpet blasts. Later there will be 7 bowls of judgment
Yes.
that will be poured out.
Some call them vials.
Yeah.
And then
Not to
7.
mention the 7 heads in the beast.
7 heads of the beast.
There's a lot of sevens.
There's
in
the 7
Revelation.
spirits of God.
And 7 is a number of completion. There's
Yeah.
7 days in the week.
7 days
Why
in
are
the
there
week?
7 days in the week? Because God
Right.
made it that way for
Right.
a reason.
Right. In chapter 10, we have the angel and the little scroll. Chapter 11, we see the 2 witnesses, and then we get the 7th trumpet blast. In Revelation 12, we get this amazing image of a woman and the red dragon. In chapter 13, we see the vision of the beast. And then in chapters 14 and 15, I like to call it God's response to all of that. Chapter 16 has the 7 bowls, or you said vials.
Depending on your translation, some will say vials.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so is the imagery something being poured out?
Yes.
Is that
Yeah,
sort of the
something
idea?
that's being poured, a liquid.
So in this case, that's symbolic of God's wrath being poured out, so to speak. Then we find in chapter 17 and 18 the doom and the fall of Babylon. Chapter 19 is sort of like a victory chapter. And then we have the interesting end of the book.
Oh, 20 and 21. They're my favorite.
Satan bound. We have the millennium, Satan released, the judgment. 21 and 22, we have new heaven and new earth, new Jerusalem, the tree of life.
It's what we have to look forward to.
Right.
It's our hope.
Who wrote the book of Revelation?
Well, it does say somewhere in Revelation, I, John.
Right. So the author identifies himself as John. Now, he doesn't say which John. John was a common name in the first century. But according to early church witnesses from the second century, they say that this was the Apostle John, the same John who was one of Jesus' 12 disciples and who wrote the Gospel of John and the 3 letters of John that we have in the Bible.
Yes, it's chapter 1, verse 9. I, John, your brother and fellow partaker in the tribulation and kingdom and perseverance which are in Jesus.
Interesting. Maybe some other John, but I like to think it's the Apostle John. And the book of Revelation is what is called apocalyptic literature. Now, what does that mean? What is an apocalypse?
Well, there's a movie called The Apocalypse.
It sounds mysterious. It sounds like cataclysmic, right?
Scary.
It's actually pretty benign. It's not scary at all. You know what the word means in Greek?
Something like revelation.
Yes, exactly. So it is the word revelation, uncovering, unveiling. Something that was covered is now uncovered.
I always get the impression of a climax.
Ah.
Apocalypse is like the climax.
But that leads us into what the purpose of the book is, and that is to reveal, to uncover what was to happen to the believers, to the disciples of Jesus. And in fact, it says to what would soon take place. Let's read it. Revelation chapter 1 and 2.
A revelation by Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his slaves the things that must shortly take place. And he sent forth his angel and presented it in signs through him to the slave John.
It's Jesus communicating the revelation he received to an angel who then communicates it to John and John to us. So that's interesting. We're kind of hopefully
Why?
yeah.
Why
Go through all that? Hopefully the telephone game didn't happen there, and the message.
Harder than that.
Yeah. What does it say? That the things which must soon take place. That is very interesting, because you expect in the first part of a book to be told the reason why the book exists. And we're told here that the things that are going to be communicated in this book are things that must soon take place. And so that leads us to whom did he write this book, and when was the book written?
Well, I would say primarily to the 7 congregations in Asia.
Right.
Everyone?
Yeah, because we are actually told who is writing and to whom he's writing.
John to the 7 churches that are in Asia.
It does say John to the 7 churches. There are the 7 assemblies or congregations that are in Asia. Now,
Yes.
not Asia as in the Eastern continent. It's Asia Minor.
Yes, it's where Paul was preaching.
Right. It's modern day Turkey
Oh,
is
okay.
what it is, actually. And you're right. It's the city of Ephesus that we have the book of Ephesians and the different cities that are listed here. So there it is. This book was not written to us. It was written to the people who were believers at that time. Now, that doesn't mean that the book is not for us, but just like pretty much every other book of the Bible, it was written for a specific reason to a specific people. And that will help us understand what is being talked about in the book, I think. Now, the thing that we have to sort of realize in the first century, putting ourselves back in the first century context, is that the church, what we understand as Christianity, was a Jewish movement, right? We know that from the book of Acts that it was the home base was in Jerusalem, that the Jewish believers, the Jewish apostles were in charge of the believers, if you will. As Jesus ascended, his apostles were the leadership that was looking over his disciples, and everybody looked to them. So even though the gospel message spread out to the nations, to the non-Jewish world, and lots of non-Jewish people became believers, they still all looked to the apostles and the Jewish leadership, therefore, for guidance and for instruction.
And if this was the Apostle John, from history, I believe, he is the one who lasted the longest. He lived the longest.
Yeah.
He wasn't killed before the others, I guess you could say. So he may be the last living of the 12 apostles at this point, and that's why it's important for him to be in this position.
John outlasted most of the other, if not all of the other apostles. He was the last one to die, and in fact, he was the only one not to be martyred. I think we need to answer this question, or at least know of the possible answers to this question. When was the book of Revelation written?
We're not given very many clues
Right.
in the book, except that he was banished to an island called Patmos.
Right.
In verse 9 of chapter 1.
Verse 9. And so that also answers the question of where it was written.
Where?
Apparently Patmos was a Greek island that was used as a Roman penal colony. So they would send convicts there. You know, John wasn't alone, but at the same time he did have, in a sense, the seclusion to receive these visions and to be able to write this book.
He wasn't in regular society.
Right. But he wasn't there by choice. But, you know, God is able to work with our circumstances, right? It's wonderful in that way. When was John exiled to Patmos? As we sort of said, we don't know exactly when. There's two main theories. Do you guys know of what decades in the first century? We're talking about the first century AD, of course, the time after Jesus. What 2 decades is the main 2 theories as to when John was exiled to Patmos and received the visions and wrote the book? Do you know, Dave?
Some think around 70 AD, and some think in the middle 90s.
Right. Those are the 2 main theories, the 2 main times that people think this could have happened. Now, here's something significant. Who were the emperors of Rome, of the Roman Empire, during those times? In the 60s it was? You
Was it
remember?
Nero?
Yep. Emperor Nero, right? And in the 90s it was Domitian. Emperor Nero and Emperor Domitian were both terrible, evil men who persecuted believers and Jewish people, and there was plenty of reason why the believers would look to the emperor and think of him in terrible, evil terms and understand him to be not on God's side. And so it's possible that Nero, as we're going to look at later, Nero persecuted the believers and exiled John to Patmos. Or it could have been under Domitian's rule. A lot of people believe that as well. Now, when this happened, whether it's the 60s or 90s, actually informs greatly how we understand the book. Because if it happened in the 60s, that means that it's possible that the things that John saw in his visions and the visions he received were just about to happen. Because there was lots of things that happened in the late 60s and in 70 AD in Jerusalem that would apply. So that, and the book does say that these are the things which will soon take place.
But yet Jesus says he's coming back soon, and it's been 2,000 years.
Right.
So what does soon really mean in a godly perspective?
Exactly. So this is the main thing, and this is what I really want us to understand and communicate. I am not saying that I know the answer to this. I don't think anyone knows for sure the proper interpretation of the book of Revelation. And if anybody claims that they do, I think they just haven't studied it enough.
Well, it's a book of symbols.
Mm-hmm.
And lots of symbols, one dependent on the other. So you can take your best guess, you can do all the research you want, but there's no way to objectively find out if you're correct.
Right. So to use the phrase that you've said in the past,
Preponderance of evidence.
the preponderance of evidence has to lead you to a conclusion. And people are welcome to have different conclusions because you can look at the evidence in different ways, of course. So in fact, as we wrap up this discussion for today, I just want us to look at the different perspectives of the book of Revelation. The perhaps most popular, at least the one I'm familiar with most, is what's called the futurist perspective. And that is to say that the visions and the symbols and images of the book of Revelation are future, certainly to John, but even to us, that they have not yet been fulfilled. And they will be fulfilled sometime in the future before Jesus returns. Just before Jesus returns, actually. There is also a perspective that I'm becoming more familiar with called the preterist perspective, and that's just a word that means something that happened in the past, something that came before. And so that's referring to the fact that you could possibly understand Revelation as all those symbols and images and everything having fulfillment in the events of the first century, the events that occurred in Jerusalem.
So the preterist would assume then that John was given this revelation in the 60s.
In the 60s AD,
The futurist would assume he was given revelation
in the 90s. That's right. That's generally how you can... that's why there's two different theories as to when it was written, because one places it just before the events of the destruction of Jerusalem, which we'll explore later, and then the other one places it after that, and so it doesn't really apply as a prophecy for those things. So then, therefore, it must be something that was to come in the future, and that's what leads some people to adopt the, what did you call it?
Continual historical.
The continual historical, or the historicist.
So it started to be fulfilled shortly after John wrote this, and it's taking from then until, and it hasn't completely been finished yet. So it's been happening throughout history since then.
So that really requires you to know history, however, if you're going to understand what any of these symbols mean.
I was never interested in history before I learned the Bible.
Right. And the last perspective, and I'm sure there's different kinds, different variations of each of these for sure. There's another perspective called the idealist perspective, which understands that the book of Revelation is not really even talking about anything specific, other than to give you images and symbols that teach you spiritual truth that you can apply to any situation, especially situations of persecution or
Well, it certainly does that at least.
Right. Well, this is why I like to embrace the eclectic perspective.
Let's take them all.
The eclectic perspective means that there's a truth in all of it. Each perspective has something to offer in understanding the book of Revelation. That, yes, some things are still future, but a lot of things, or maybe some or a lot of things were already fulfilled in the past. But lots of history after John and the first century has also application or fulfillment. But then, as you just said, there's also lots of ideal, sort of symbolic things that teach a spiritual truth that can be applied in any situation.
Absolutely. Right? When I was reading the book of Revelation many years ago, I was going through something in my life, and I read the line somewhere in these symbols where the letter said, "Hold on to what you have." Okay, I can do that.
Right. Exactly.
I can hold on to what I've got. I don't have to worry about reaching forward at this time because in my situation, I'm hanging on by my fingernails.
Right.
So I'll do that.
We can all agree that as you just said, we can all agree that the book of Revelation provides an incredible amount of encouragement and call for us to hold on, to overcome, to persevere. By my count, 7 different times, just in those letters in chapters 2 and 3, that Jesus says, "To him who overcomes."
That's one for each of the churches.
Exactly. So the first one, "To him who overcomes, I will grant to eat of the tree of life in the paradise of God. He who overcomes will not be hurt by the second death." And it goes on. But the idea is, each of these promises that Jesus gives to these churches are things that are there at the end of the book.
Yes, so they're promises to us too. If we overcome what we have to overcome.
Exactly. So these are the amazing promises of the book of Revelation that certainly applied to the first century believers, but have applied to all believers, including us today. That we can be a part of that glorious future ahead of us if we persevere, if we hold on.
Yes. Amen.
The book of Revelation can be hard to understand, but by answering some of these foundational questions about the book, I hope that we've begun to demystify it a bit. But if you take nothing else away from the book of Revelation, get this: there is a hopeful future ahead of us. Each of us goes through challenges and tribulations just as the first century believers did. But the overwhelming and consistent message of the book of Revelation is don't give up. Keep going. Persevere. Be an overcomer, one who overcomes the challenges and the tribulations. And we do this, of course, in God's strength, and we trust that He is sending His Son Jesus soon. And amen, may He come soon. Come, Lord Jesus.
God, I'm running for your heart. I'm running for your heart. Till I am a soul on fire. Lord, I'm longing for your ways. I'm waiting for the day when I am a soul on fire. Till I am a soul on fire. God, I'm running for your heart. I'm running for your heart. Till I am a soul on fire. Lord, I'm longing for your way. I'm waiting for the day when I am a soul on fire. Till I am a soul on fire. Lord, restore the joy I had. And I have wandered. Bring me back in this darkness, lead me through until all I see is you. God, I'm running for your heart. I'm running for your heart till I am a soul on fire. Lord, I'm longing for your way. I'm waiting for the day when I am a soul on fire. Till I am a soul on fire. Lord, let me burn for you again. Let me return to you again. And Lord, let me burn for you again. And let me return to you again. God, I'm running for your heart. I'm running for your heart till I am a soul on fire. Lord, I'm longing for your ways. I'm waiting for the day when I am a soul on fire. God, I'm running for your heart. I'm running for your heart till I